September 3, 1939, Malvern, Worcestershire, England. Rain drummed softly against the windows of the telecommunications research establishment, a small but critical outpost hidden among the rolling green hills. Inside, the air buzzed faintly with electricity. Oscilloscopes hummed, valves glowed orange, and the scent of ozone mixed with the metallic tang of hot copper. At a cluttered wooden workbench, Dr. Robert Watson Watt's protégé, a young physicist named Dr. Gerald Touch, adjusted the dials of an experimental radiofrequency generator. He wasn't testing weaponry, nor designing radar. He was studying the propagation of electromagnetic waves through the atmosphere. The war had just begun that morning, but for Touch, the battle was still a distant storm. As he tuned the transmitter, a colleague monitoring the base's radar receiver suddenly frowned. "Jerry, you're not going to believe this," he muttered, squinting at the cathode ray tube. The sweeping green line, the heartbeat of Britain's radar defense, had vanished into noise. The radar had gone blind. Touch looked up, confused. Blind? How? The transmitter's not even on full power. He toggled the switch again, and the screen flared, the radar blip returned, then vanished once more into a haze of static. Every time he transmitted, the receiver filled with meaningless echoes, drowning out the returning radar pings. They exchanged a glance, part amazement, part disbelief. What had he just done? Radar was still a fledgling technology, one that Britain hoped would serve as its invisible shield against German bombers. And yet here, in a modest lab surrounded by sheep fields, a single radio transmitter had managed to blind it. Hours passed as the two scientists ran tests, their curiosity overtaking caution. Each frequency shift and power change yielded the same startling result: the radar's signal disappeared under a blanket of interference. Touch recorded every measurement meticulously, unaware that this anomaly would soon be placed under military lock and key. In the official logbook, the entry read: "Observed interference effect when transmitting on certain harmonics. Causes radar return loss." No one yet understood the implications. But Britain had just stumbled upon a secret so powerful it could rewrite the rules of air warfare. Outside, the rain thickened into a storm. Thunder rumbled across the hills, drowning the hum of machines. In the flickering light of the lab, the two men continued their experiments, unaware that the very signal they had created could one day save thousands of Allied airmen flying through enemy skies. For now, it was just static. Noise. But soon, it would become the most sophisticated deception in the war's arsenal: radar jamming. Within days, the report from Malvern made its way up the chain of command, from the modest wooden office of Dr. Gerald Touch to the secret corridors of Bawdsey Manor, the nerve center of Britain's early radar research. The Air Ministry classified it immediately. What Touch had discovered was not an inconvenience, it was a weapon. By early October 1939, Group Captain Edward "Teddy" Bufton, a senior officer in RAF Fighter Command, stood before a team of scientists in a dimly lit war room. A massive map of southern England sprawled across the wall, dotted with pins marking the newly built radar stations, part of what was known as the Chain Home Network. "These stations," Bufton said, tapping the map, "are our eyes. The moment the Luftwaffe takes off from France, we see them coming. If the Germans ever discover how to blind our radar, we're finished." Silence hung over the room. Then, almost as an afterthought, one scientist raised a question. "What if we blinded theirs first?" It was a suggestion that changed the entire mood. Heads turned. Bufton's eyes narrowed. The Germans, too, were known to be developing radar systems along their coasts, the Freya and Würzburg networks. If these could be jammed, Britain might strike unseen. Dr. Touch's accidental interference now had a name: window. But at first, window didn't refer to jamming signals. It referred to something simpler: thin strips of aluminum foil, cut to a precise length to reflect radar waves. When dropped from aircraft, they created thousands of false echoes, flooding enemy radar screens with ghost planes. It was an idea derived directly from the same interference Touch had observed: electromagnetic confusion, chaos in the ether. The plan was as ingenious as it was dangerous. If Britain used it first, the Germans might copy it, blinding British radar in return. For years, the concept sat locked in secret folders, stamped most secret, do not implement without Prime Minister's approval. While the aluminum window awaited authorization, a parallel project emerged, one that returned to Touch's original discovery: electronic jamming. In late 1940, a small detachment of scientists from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, began experimenting with airborne transmitters designed to mimic and overwhelm radar frequencies. They called the project Mandrel. The tests were crude at first. RAF bombers carried bulky radio sets, their operators twisting dials mid-flight, trying to find frequencies that matched the German radar bands. When they succeeded, something remarkable happened. German radar stations saw their scopes fill with static, flickering shapes, and phantom aircraft that didn't exist. To the Germans, it looked like the British had suddenly multiplied tenfold. To the British, it meant survival. By 1941, the TRE had begun fine-tuning these systems, transforming laboratory accidents into strategic tools. Mandrel transmitters were mounted on short Sterling and Handley Page Halifax bombers, each acting as a moving cloud of electromagnetic noise. The effect was astonishing. Radar operators in occupied France and Holland reported severe interference, their screens blooming with meaningless echoes. Reports flowed to Berlin: something was blinding their systems, and they couldn't tell if the incoming aircraft were hundreds or thousands. Meanwhile, Dr. Gerald Touch, now working under strict secrecy, watched as his discovery left the confines of the lab and entered the war zone. He was proud, but uneasy. What began as a fluke in a Worcestershire lab had become a tool of deception, one that could mean the difference between life and death for entire bomber crews. Every time the radar blipped with static over Europe, it whispered the echo of that first accident, the night the sky went silent in Malvern. And soon, that silence would cover the skies of Germany itself. March 1943, RAF Oakington, Cambridgeshire. Engines roared in the damp night air as the Lancaster bombers of No. 7 Squadron prepared for another mission deep into enemy territory. Ground crews moved like shadows under the amber floodlights, tightening bolts, checking radios, and loading bombs marked Berlin. Inside the cockpit of Lancaster, S for Sugar, Flight Lieutenant Peter Moore glanced over his shoulder at the new, unfamiliar box mounted beside his navigator's table, a rectangular metal case with glowing dials and a humming vent. "What's that one, then?" he asked, adjusting his flight helmet. His radio operator grinned. "New toy from Malvern, sir. They call it Mandrel. Supposed to make Jerry's radar go blind." Moore chuckled skeptically. "As long as it doesn't make me go deaf." But Mandrel wasn't just a gadget, it was a lifeline. For the first time in the war, Allied bombers were about to fly with an invisible shield around them, created not by armor, but by radio waves. As the aircraft lumbered down the runway and lifted into the night sky, the operator switched the device on. A faint oscillating tone filled the headphones, like static at the edge of hearing. Far below, in the occupied Netherlands, German radar operators at a Würzburg station frowned at their screens. Their usual clear arcs of approaching bombers vanished into a haze of flickering light. The radar beams, reflected and scattered by Mandrel's interference, created hundreds of false returns. Operators shouted to one another, adjusting frequency after frequency, but the blinding fog of electromagnetic noise remained. One German officer slammed his fist on the console. "Verdammt! They are ghosts." Meanwhile, the Lancasters crossed the coast undetected. For once, there were no early warning sirens, no ready squadrons waiting in ambush. Britain had entered the age of electronic warfare, and the enemy didn't even realize it yet. Back at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the scientists were tracking every detail. The results were conclusive. Mandrel was working. It could create corridors of radar blindness stretching for hundreds of miles. Encouraged by these results, they developed new systems in parallel: Carpet, designed to jam ground control intercept radar, and Jostle, a high-power jammer that could reach deep into Germany itself. Each was a weapon not of firepower, but of confusion. RAF Bomber Command began to organize bomber streams, massive formations of aircraft flying through these invisible corridors of jamming. Instead of hundreds of planes being picked off one by one, they now passed through German radar as a single blurry shadow. The night fighters scrambled too late or flew in the wrong direction entirely. To the men in the air, it felt like a miracle. Flight Lieutenant Moore would later write in his diary. It was strange, the searchlights were still, the flak quiet. For once, the night felt on our side. But behind that quiet triumph was a brutal truth: every improvement in jamming pushed the enemy to counter it. And the Luftwaffe's scientists, no less brilliant, began racing to unravel Britain's invisible defense. Soon, a new battle would erupt, one unseen, unheard, but fought every night above the clouds. The war in the ether had truly begun. And at its center stood the man who had started it all, Dr. Gerald Tuch, now watching as nations waged war with his accidental discovery. He had given Britain the power to vanish from enemy eyes. But the question remained, for how long? June 1943, Peenemünde, Germany. Deep within the pine forests of the Baltic coast, the German Luftwaffe's top scientists huddled around a circular radar display glowing an eerie green in the dark. The Würzburg-Reese dish outside turned slowly, scanning the night sky. Oberst Dr. Johannes Plendl, one of the Reich's foremost radar experts, watched as the beam flickered with noise. Again, he ordered, voice tight with irritation. The technician restarted the sweep. Once more, the radar screen filled with chaotic static. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was deliberate interference. The British had found their frequency. What is this? Mandrel? Plendl asked under his breath. Reports from occupied France, Holland, and Denmark all told the same story: radar blindness. The English were sending out signals powerful enough to drown their returns. The Germans called it Funkstörung, radio disturbance. And it was crippling their early warning network. Plendl leaned over the operator's shoulder, adjusting a tuning knob. "If they can jam us," he said quietly, "we must learn to see through the noise." That sentence marked the beginning of a technological arms race unlike any other in history. Back in Britain, the telecommunications research establishment could feel the tension rising. Intelligence reports from the Y Service, Britain's signal interception branch, indicated that the Germans were adapting, shifting frequencies, deploying Nicobine navigation beams, and experimenting with anti-jamming filters. The scientists at Malvern were under immense pressure. Each time they devised a new jamming system, the Luftwaffe found a partial workaround. The war in the air had become a cat-and-mouse game played at the speed of light. By late 1943, Dr. Gerald Tuch was now working on a new secret, a method of coordinated jamming that would combine Mandrel, Carpet, and Jostle across entire bomber formations. It was codenamed Corona. Corona didn't just blind radar. It spoke through it. Operators in England transmitted fake German voices over the same radio frequencies used by Luftwaffe night fighter controllers. The impersonations were flawless, fluent, calm, commanding. All night fighters returned to base. Repeat, return to base. The deception worked alarmingly well. Dozens of German pilots obeyed the false orders, abandoning their intercepts mid-mission. At the same time, radar screens across occupied Europe were engulfed in chaos. The jammers screamed across the ether, drowning out legitimate signals. In the skies over the Rhine, RAF Bomber Command tested the new coordination system during Operation Gemara, the firebombing of Hamburg. It was the first full-scale deployment of both window and electronic jamming. As bombers approached the German coast, navigators released tons of aluminum strips from their bomb bays. The night sky glittered like silver rain. German radar rooms descended into pandemonium. Hundreds of phantom echoes filled every scope, tens of thousands of ghost aircraft appearing out of nowhere. Operators screamed, calling in targets that didn't exist. Anti-aircraft gunners fired wildly into the darkness, their shells bursting against empty air. Meanwhile, the real bombers flew straight through the confusion, undetected. The result was catastrophic for Germany. Hamburg burned for 8 nights. Entire districts were incinerated, and the Luftwaffe's once feared radar network was left paralyzed. To Dr. Tuch and his colleagues, the reports were staggering. Their invention, born from a chance interference, had given Britain complete dominance of the night sky. Yet amid the celebration, a deep unease lingered. Tuch confided to a colleague. "We have given men the power to disappear. But I wonder if we understand the price." Because with every jamming wave Britain unleashed, Germany retaliated, developing new radars, new filters, new tricks of their own. The war in the ether was no longer just about who could see, but who could hide better. And soon, this invisible war would decide the fate of D-Day itself. June 5, 1944, south coast of England. The wind whipped across the tarmac of RAF Thorney Island as ground crews made final checks on squadrons of Halifax bombers and Lancasters lined up under a moonless sky. The engines were still cold, but every plane carried something far more powerful than bombs. Mounted beneath their fuselages were the newest generation of jamming transmitters, Mandrel Mk2, Carpet, Jostle, and Airborne Cigar. Together, these machines would form an electromagnetic storm over the English Channel. Nearby, in a dimly lit command tent, a voice crackled over the radio. "Operation Overlord is a go. Begin deception phase. Mandrel stations, activate." Inside the aircraft codenamed Mothball 4, Flight Officer Harold Kent reached for the red toggle switch marked Mandrel, on. He hesitated for just a moment, then flipped it up. Instantly, a low, vibrating hum filled the cabin. The dials flickered to life, needles dancing as the transmitter flooded the sky with noise. Invisible waves of static rolled outward, spreading like ripples through the dark air. Far across the channel, German radar operators stationed along the coast of Normandy and Calais frowned at their screens. The clear sweeps of radar beams began to dissolve. The familiar, precise dots of aircraft returns blurred into meaningless haze. "Something's wrong," one shouted. "The Freya network is overloaded." "It's interference, Herr Lieutenant, the English again." They tried to recalibrate, shifting frequencies, adjusting gain, but the more they turned, the worse it got. The entire western front of German radar was blind. At that same moment, a second deception was taking place. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, two of the most audacious tricks in modern warfare, were underway. Small groups of RAF bombers flew in tight, looping patterns off the coast of Calais, dropping window in carefully timed bursts. Each cluster of aluminum foil created false radar reflections, thousands of phantom ships slowly advancing toward the French coast. To the German High Command, it appeared that the Allies were preparing to land not at Normandy, but at Calais, exactly where they expected. As the real invasion fleet steamed toward the beaches of Normandy under the cover of darkness, German radar screens told a different story, one carefully crafted by British scientists, jamming operators, and the ghostly echoes of radio interference. Dr. Gerald Tuch, now stationed at the TRE's Forward Operations Center, sat before a bank of radio receivers, monitoring the chaos. His face was pale, illuminated by the dull red glow of the instruments. "Mandrel groups are holding steady," an operator reported. "Carpet coverage is effective across the channel," another confirmed. Tuch exhaled. The plan was working. The Germans were fighting ghosts. June 6, 1944, 2:30 a.m. In Normandy, German radar stations at Ouistreham and Le Havre were in disarray. The operators could barely distinguish signal from noise. Some believed the invasion was a trick, others thought their instruments had malfunctioned. By the time the first paratroopers dropped into St. Miraculously, German High Command still had no clear picture of what was happening. The Allied invasion, the largest amphibious assault in history, had caught the enemy half-blind. For the men storming the beaches, radar jamming was invisible salvation. The Luftwaffe's night fighters arrived late and scattered, unable to find their targets amid the electromagnetic confusion. Allied bombers roamed freely, striking German fortifications without early warning. All across southern England, radio technicians and TRE scientists listened to intercepted German communications, a symphony of confusion. One phrase repeated again and again. Unser Radar sind tot. Our radars are dead. By dawn, the beaches of Normandy were secured. And as the sun rose over the smoke and chaos, Dr. Gerald Touch stood silently at his listening post, staring at the signal meters now calming into stillness. He realized then that his accidental discovery, the strange interference that had once puzzled him in that rainy Worcestershire lab, had helped shape one of the most decisive victories in modern history. The static he had once dismissed as noise had become the sound of liberation. But the war wasn't over. Germany would not stay blind forever. The invisible duel in the ether was about to enter its most dangerous phase, as both sides raced to master the final frontier of wartime technology, the guided weapon. July 1944, Northern France. The front lines were advancing fast. Allied troops pushed inland from Normandy, but high above the battlefield, a new terror was emerging, one that no jamming transmitter could easily stop. At 4:18 a.m., air raid sirens wailed over London. A faint roaring filled the sky, followed by the mechanical sputter of a jet engine. Civilians craned their necks upward, a flickering orange flame streaked across the night. When the sound suddenly cut out, everyone knew what came next. Seconds later, V-1 flying bombs slammed into the city. The explosions lit the horizon in angry bursts. The age of radio-guided weapons had begun. Dr. Gerald Touch, now serving as chief consultant to the Countermeasures Division, was called back to the telecommunications research establishment under urgent orders. The Germans were using radio beams to guide their new weapons, and Britain's survival depended on blinding those systems, just as it had blinded radar. He studied intercepted technical reports, Kell Strasberg, control links, FUG 203 transmitters, complex guidance signals oscillating across the same spectrum he once used for Mandrel. The same trick that jammed radar, he murmured, might jam their bombs. Within weeks, the TRE had created Project Carpet 2, a high-frequency jammer specifically tuned to disrupt German control signals. Specially equipped Mosquito fighters were fitted with these new devices and sent to intercept the V-1 and V-2 control transmissions. But unlike radar, these signals were fleeting, narrow, powerful, and fast-moving. Jamming them required precision timing. Every flight was a race against physics. During one tense night over the Channel, Squadron Leader Edward Lewis flew his Mosquito low and fast, following the telltale sound of a V-1's pulsejet. His radio operator locked onto the control frequency. Signal stable, now. Lewis hit the switch. The jamming transmitter screamed into life. The V-1's flame flickered. Its guidance faltered. Moments later, the weapon spiraled out of control, plunging harmlessly into the sea. Back at Malvern, Touch and his team listened to the intercepts, the moment of silence when the missile's signal vanished. It was proof, radio jamming could defeat even Hitler's so-called Vergeltungswaffen, weapons of vengeance. But there was no time to celebrate. The Germans soon shifted to V-2 rockets, supersonic, ballistic, and unstoppable once launched. They couldn't be jammed, they couldn't even be seen on radar until they hit. For the first time, Touch faced a limit to his invisible weapon. In a classified memo dated September 1944, he wrote, "We have silenced their radar, confused their pilots, blinded their searchlights. But now they strike from beyond the air, and our instruments can only listen. Still, Britain's mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum continued to grow. New jammers were installed on naval escorts, fighter bombers, and even ground stations. The airwaves themselves had become a battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with oscillations, harmonics, and power surges. And though the V-weapons terrorized London for months, their impact was less than what the Reich had hoped. Germany's wonder weapons had come too late, and their guidance too crude to break through Britain's electronic defenses for long. As winter fell in 1944, Dr. Touch returned home to Malvern for the first time in years. The same small brick laboratory where it all began was still there, the bench cluttered, the old transmitter silent. He stood by the window, the same one streaked with rain that night in 1939, and looked out across the quiet hills. The war had transformed that accidental interference into a vast, invisible weapon, one that had reshaped the skies. He realized then that radar jamming was not just a defensive tool, it had birthed an entirely new kind of warfare. Battles were now fought in frequencies, won not by brute strength, but by knowledge, timing, and deception. The static he had once created in error had grown into an empire of silence, one that could blind, confuse, and protect. But even as victory loomed on the horizon, the scientists of both sides knew one thing: the next war would not begin with bullets or bombs. It would begin with a signal. May 8, 1945, London. The streets were alive with cheers, flags, and the ringing of church bells. Victory in Europe Day. After 6 long years, the guns had finally fallen silent. But inside a small room at the telecommunications research establishment, there was no celebration, only quiet reflection. Dr. Gerald Touch sat alone at his desk, surrounded by stacks of reports, schematics, and signal readouts. He ran a finger along the worn metal casing of his first transmitter, the same device that had once blinded a radar set by accident in 1939. Outside, Britain was celebrating victory. Inside, Touch was staring into the static. He thought of the countless lives saved, the bombers that had returned home under the cover of Mandrel's jamming fields, the paratroopers who'd landed in Normandy while German radars saw ghosts, the cities spared from destruction because enemy aircraft never saw them coming. But he also thought of what his discovery had unleashed, a new kind of weapon, one that could deceive without killing, or kill without warning. He picked up his pen and wrote in his personal notebook. "We have mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. What began as noise has become the voice of power." As peace returned, Britain's wartime scientists were reassigned to new divisions. The telecommunications research establishment became the cradle of electronic intelligence, later evolving into systems that would define the Cold War: radar countermeasures, guided missile defense, and early warning networks stretching across Europe. Touch himself faded from public view. His name was never mentioned in newspapers, his role buried under layers of secrecy. The story of radar jamming would not be declassified for decades. Yet his influence was everywhere. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, the Royal Air Force, and even the Soviets adopted techniques derived directly from his accidental experiment. Every modern stealth operation, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, could trace its lineage back to that night in Malvern when a single transmitter drowned out a radar beam. Where once armies fought for ground and skies, they now fought for bandwidth, for the right to see and to remain unseen. 1965, 30 years after the discovery. An aging Dr. Gerald Touch was invited to speak privately before a select group of young Royal Air Force engineers at Farnborough. His hair had turned white, his hands trembled slightly, but his voice still carried that calm precision of a scientist who understood both the beauty and the burden of invention. He gestured toward a chart of modern radar arrays and missile defense systems. "Gentlemen," he said, "the next war will not begin with tanks. It will begin with silence, the kind that makes machines go blind." The room was silent. The young officers watched him, realizing they were listening to the man who had, in a sense, invented invisibility. Touch smiled faintly. "And I suppose," he added, it all began because I didn't calibrate my transmitter properly." Laughter broke the tension, but his eyes were distant, lost in memory, perhaps to that stormy night in 1939 when everything had changed. In the decades that followed, radar jamming evolved into electronic warfare, a realm so advanced that entire squadrons could vanish from enemy detection. Satellites, drones, and stealth aircraft all owed their existence to one serendipitous mistake made in a damp English laboratory at the dawn of World War II. From Malvern's humming generators to the sleek stealth bombers of the modern age, the thread was unbroken. A discovery born of curiosity had rewritten the laws of war. Epilogue. Today, few remember Dr. Gerald Touch by name. His reports remain buried in military archives, his transmitter a forgotten relic in a dusty museum storeroom. But his legacy hums quietly in the air, in every scrambled radar signal, every stealth aircraft, every unseen defense shield orbiting far above Earth. Because on one rainy night in 1939, a British scientist made radar go blind, and in doing so, taught the world the power of silence.